Hello again. So before I begin my talk this morning, I will show some slides of Suzuki Roshi's home temple in Japan, Rinso-in. And included in this brief slideshow is a picture of his young grandson, Konro, some photos of the surround of his temple, and some archival pictures of Suzuki Roshi's wife, Mitsu Suzuki, who we call Oksan, a haiku poet and tea teacher of the Japanese tea ceremony, who is the primary focus of my talk today. Hello again. So I'd like to continue today with a teaching from the beloved founder of the San Francisco Zen Center, Shunryu Suzuki Roshi. This story is taken from Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind in the section called Right Attitude. There were two good friends, Chokei and Hofuku, and they were talking about the Bodhisattva's way. And Chokei said, even if the Arhat, an enlightened one, were to have evil desires, still, the Tathagata, the Buddha, does not have two kinds of words. I say that the Tathagata has words, but no dualistic words. Hofuku said, well, even though you say so, your comment is not perfect. Chokei asked, what is your understanding of the Tathagata's words? Hofuku said, we've had enough discussion, so let's have a cup of tea. Suzuki Roshi continues, Hofuku did not give his friend an answer because it is impossible to give a verbal interpretation of our way. Nevertheless, as part of their practice, these two good friends discussed the Bodhisattva's way, even though they did not expect to find a new interpretation. So Hofuku answered, our discussion is over, let's have a cup of tea. So this is a very good answer, isn't it? It's the same for my talk. When my talk is over, your listening is over. There is no need to remember what I say. There is no need to understand what I say. You understand. You have full understanding within yourself. There is no problem. A week or so ago, I went to have an eye exam, and one of the many mysterious machines that my doctor used, as she explained, was for the purpose of checking my peripheral vision. And inside of this large white bowl-shaped device was a bright yellow dot, which I was told to focus on without getting distracted. Meanwhile, as I was told, there would appear in various locations around the yellow dot some flashing white dots. And each time I saw one, without shifting my gaze, I was to push a button on a handheld clicker. Well, it wasn't until later in that week, while I was thinking about what I might say for this celebration of Suzuki Roshi, that I thought what a wonderful metaphor that machine turned out to be. There in the center of our Zen Center mandala is the name, image, and memory of our Japanese Zen teacher, Shunryu Suzuki Roshi. And there, all around him, the much dimmer lights, his own teachers, his family members, and the many students who came to study with him. Included among them, those peripheral lights, a small-bodied woman, also Japanese, who we called Suzuki Sensei, or fondly Okusan, meaning wife. My wish in honoring our founder is to move that peripheral light in toward the center, which is where she was for me, and for many of us who have been living in this community together for a great number of years now. Suzuki Roshi had died 7 years before I arrived at Zen Center, and yet the traces of his life were in abundance. The lectures, the photographs, Zen ritual clothing and hairstyles, and most importantly of all, the living legacy of his disciples, who continue training in the style of his house up to this very day. Reflecting back on those early days, it was not uncommon to have the young teachers talking about Roshi and to read from his well-known and much-loved book, Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind. In fact, I did not connect that book to my arrival at Zen Center until some time later when I saw his iconic photograph on a wall in the Founders Hall. I had first seen that sweet open face a number of years previously when I was working at a bookstore in Jackson Hole, Wyoming. There were very few books on the religion and spirituality shelf, maybe 5, and that book truly stood out from the others, both inside and out. It's a beautifully crafted book. The choice of paper, the typeface, and the cover art, a Suzuki Roshi calligraphy done with a yucca plant during his time at Tassajara. This small book of Suzuki Roshi lectures, carefully edited by his disciples, was originally published by John Weatherhill Incorporated of New York and Tokyo in 1970, and now we are celebrating its 50th year of renewed publication. Along with all of that, there was, still living at Zen Center, his vibrant and talented widow, Mitsu Suzuki, who had promised her husband 3 things before he died: that she would learn to write haiku poetry, that she would master the art of tea ceremony, and that she would stay at Zen Center for another 10 years to look after the students who he so dearly loved. Not a word that is overly used in the corridors of our Zen temples. My own secret plan on entering into the study of Zen at the San Francisco Zen Center was to find a way to get close to Mrs. Suzuki, who I imagined would be the very best source for understanding who he was, who he truly was, and whether his human side would hold up well to the mythic side, which was already flourishing within the community. It wasn't long after having that thought that I heard the Suzuki Sensei was accepting new students for the study of the Japanese tea ceremony, cha no yu, boiling water for tea. And quite honestly, I had no knowledge or interest in tea, but I signed up anyway in hopes of getting as close as I could to what I considered to be the source. Well, not only did I arrive at the source, I also arrived at an amazing teacher who gave to our community a living exemplar of all that her husband and the Soto Zen tradition has to teach: kindness, respect for each other, and attention to fine detail, also known as the wind or style of this house, Menmitsu no Kofu. A few years ago, I was invited to give a lecture at the City Center in San Francisco on the occasion of Suzuki Sensei's 100th birthday. She had not only stayed on with us for 10 years, as she had promised, but she added another 10, finally returning to Japan and living several more decades as a revered elder and a much celebrated haiku poet. She won several times the yearly Eiheiji Haiku Poetry Award. Our beloved sensei passed away in her home, surrounded by family, on January 9th of 2016, the 101st year of her very, very big life. So I want to express my gratitude to Lion's Roar for the opportunity to honor Suzuki Roshi and his dear wife, Suzuki Sensei, as well as to honor the wonderful living art form called Cha no Yu, which had connected me to it all, starting over 40 years ago when I first stepped through the doorway of what we still fondly call Beginner's Mind Temple. So as I begin this talk with one of the haiku that Suzuki Sensei had written in a collection later published under the title The White Tea Bowl, after one of her poems, written in memory of the life she shared, not only with her beloved husband, but which they together had shared with all of us as well. Here's the poem. I pour sencha into the white porcelain tea bowl he loved. When I first heard the title of her collection of poems, I thought to myself I had never seen a white tea bowl, and then I thought how very much I would like to see one. So tea ceremony has that effect on those of us who practice tea together. We love to see, touch, and talk about the objects that have been brought into the tea room for that day, and to hear what are called the transmission stories, stories about how and when this object was made, what kind of clay or glaze was used, who the artist was, who acquired the object, and who is taking care of it now. It's these stories that empower these objects, which reveals to us their aura and establishes the strength of their presence. For example, there's the tea bowl itself, the chawan, such as the one given to my teacher by her mother over 70 years ago when she was just a little girl, or the one memorialized by Suzuki Sensei in the haiku she had written shortly after Suzuki Roshi had died. Tea is an inheritance of the great mystery called Zen, and it's all about feelings as far as I can tell. Those exquisite feelings that come from being with old friends, from learning new things, from honoring age-old craft, but most of all, it's from the dance. It's the dance, I think, that gets you hooked on tea, starting with your own tiny toes wrapped inside those tight white tabi. So as with the practice of seated meditation, the practice of tea begins once your upright body has settled into the place of practice, after which you take a few breaths and you completely let go. For the practice of Zen, you let go because that's what Dogen Zenji told us to do. For the practice of tea, it's because there's utterly no way to remember what you are supposed to do next. You have to rely on your body, the body which has been carefully taught over many years of repetition, a pattern of intricate and exquisitely linked movements of your eyes and your hands. And if you miss one step, you will quickly discover that there is no place left to go as you become frozen in your tracks. Tea is, in fact, a very tightly woven set of highly visible consequences from which there are only a very few elegant ways to escape. Mostly, your fellow students will giggle when you drop the whisk or you forget to add water to the tea. My very favorite story about big mistakes is the one that occurred in front of a large audience. The woman who was performing the tea ceremony over there in Japan was quite old and venerable. There's a particularly challenging seasonal form that involves unhooking the kettle of water, which is hanging from an iron chain above the fire on its thick layer of ash, and moving it up a few lengths, and then having done a few things with the fire, moving the kettle back down again. A move that Suzuki Sensei memorializes in this warm-hearted poem, perhaps thinking, as she wrote, of one of us. A young monk performs tea ceremony. Hanging kettle sways slightly. There's a saying in tea that you should lift heavy things as if they're light and light things as if they're heavy. So this old woman lifted the heavy kettle skillfully. However, she couldn't really see so well and missed the hook onto the link up above. The kettle fell into the fire, and a great cloud of ashes rose up in all directions. Without changing the expression on her face, she reached down, lifted the kettle, hooked it correctly, and continued making tea. And that's what I would call supreme emotional intelligence, another hallmark of the maturing practice of Zen. So once those of us of somewhat lesser intelligence have become frozen during tea, kindly or not, your teacher will remind your body of what it needs to do next. I can still hear Suzuki Sensei's voice ringing in my ears. Fusan, many times I've told you, little front, Saido Saido, referring to the placement of your fingers on the tea bowl, one of the most basic and simplest of instructions. Fusan, hi sensei, sumimasen, please forgive me. Well, if all goes well, which it rarely does, it will take about 40 minutes to navigate the minute instructions required to produce 3 tiny sips of bright green tea. All the while, your knees are on the mats at levels of discomfort that it's hard to imagine one would ever voluntarily be willing to bear. And yet, for unknown reasons, you stay there until you're done. It's especially at times like that when the famous saying written on the scroll comes to life. Tea and Zen are one. Stay until you're done. So it's all about feelings, feelings that lead you to know how wonderful it is to be alive, to be standing, walking, eating, and visiting with a friend, feelings that are all too easy to forget. And so we practice them again and again. We practice having feelings, all kinds of feelings. Personally, I've decided after over 40 years of studying tea and practicing Zen that the entire enterprise is designed to challenge and thereby re-educate our neuronal pathways, the pathways of form and feeling, of perception and impulse and of consciousness, the very 5 heaps that make up the Buddha's teaching of what we call the self, the illusory self. And although not truly there, it's the only thing that we've got that can be educated. When I first decided to ask Suzuki Sensei if I could study tea with her, my motives, as I said, were less than pure. I had no idea what tea was, nor was I particularly interested in finding out. I wanted to get close to Suzuki Roshi, who had already died, and whose memory and reputation at Zen Center was the living basis for the community. Everyone was grieving who had known him, and there was his wife who had known him best of all. I wanted to hear her speak about her husband, which she rarely did. She didn't have to. Suzuki Roshi, as with the Buddhas before him, wasn't gone. He was embodied in those who had loved him. And he still is, and so is she. And that's how it works. You love your teachers for all the things they have given to you through their selfless practice, lifting heavy things as if they are light, and light things as if they are heavy. I love Suzuki Sensei because she was my teacher. All of us can think back on those people who opened us up to the light of the world. Of course, our parents gave us the initial boost with language, walking, and hopefully cleaning our rooms, and then we went off to school. My first real teacher from the big world outside of my home was Mr. Brown in the 3rd grade. He took our class out beyond the asphalt playground into the fields of weeds behind the chain-linked fence, and then he turned over a big rock. And oh my gosh, there were so many tiny little creepy things moving around, getting away from the light. It was so disorienting to experience the world as more than what it seemed, more than human, out of control, and deeply mysterious. And I thank you, Mr. Brown. I thank you, Suzuki Sensei. I thank you, Tenshin Roshi. I thank everybody for disorienting me again and again. There are a few well-known stories about the practice of tea, some from within the tea tradition itself and others from Zen. The roots of tea and Zen have been entwined from its very earliest beginnings in China. In fact, it's rumored that the tea plant itself grew from the eyelids of Bodhidharma when he tore them off and cast them to the ground in his determination to stay awake while sitting upright in his cavern. And that's why those Daruma dolls have those big, unblinking eyes, something to scare the kids. It may be more factual that the drinking of powder green tea called matcha entered Japan during the Song dynasty at the end of the 12th century, with the Buddhist monks who had gone there to study Zen. At first, it was used to overcome drowsiness during long periods of meditation, and also as a medicine, being fully loaded with both caffeine and vitamin C. Eventually, tea took hold within Japanese culture as not only a medicinal drink, but as a tasty beverage. And as a consequence, the number of tea plantations and the comparisons among them increased to become one of the major industries in Japan. Within a few hundred years, the making of tea, the value of tea utensils, and the writing of poetry all converged as warrior, merchant, and upper class sport. Around the 15th century, the practice of making tea in front of the guests, rather than having it brought in from another room, became a cultural norm. This act of making a bowl of tea in front of others is called the temai, and it's the temai that we studied in our classes each week. Of the many stories about the tradition of tea, I particularly like the ones about Sendo Rikyu, the 16th century tea master who perfected the tea ceremony and raised it to the level of an art. Sendo Rikyu reestablished the practice of tea in all of its aspects, in keeping with its earlier monastic form. Under Rikyu, the temai, the utensil, the tea garden landscaping, and the tea house architecture were all governed by such aesthetic ideals as wabi, meaning deliberate simplicity in daily living, and sabi, meaning appreciation of the old and the faded. So one day, Rikyu was invited by a tea grower, a farmer, to come for tea. The tea grower was very fond of the tea ceremony and practiced as often as time allowed. Rikyu arrived at the old man's tea house, bringing with him one of his promising young disciples as a second guest. Being very nervous, his hands visibly shaking, the grower made a number of obvious mistakes. And yet at the finish, Rikyu said to him in all sincerity, "This tea you have made is the finest." On the way home, the disciple asked Rikyu how he could have made such a comment, given the amateur performance by that man. Rikyu replied, "He made tea for me with his whole heart. When you can do that as well, you will have mastered the art of tea." When I think about Suzuki Sensei, wholeheartedness is certainly the dominant quality through which she lived her life. Whether she was teaching us tea or doing her daily exercises up and down the hall, singing children's songs at the top of her lungs, or carefully bowing each time she passed in front of the founder's hall upstairs, and each time she passed in front of us, she was wholehearted. And she still was on the day when T-Sensei Maya Wender and I went to Japan in 2013. We were so blessed to be taken to see her in her home in Yaizu, where she was living with her daughter and nearby her great-grandchildren. She spent nearly 2 hours with us, showing us the photo albums that Zen Center had given her years ago, full of pictures of us. She pointed to the tea kettle sitting in the corner of the room. She smiled at me and said, "There's your old friend, Fusan." I think she knew very well that Zen Center needed her to stay here for a while until the Shinmei, the new growth, had a chance to strengthen and to flower. Her presence and example were a through line from temple life she'd known in Japan to our sincere efforts to ground our own culture's practice in Suzuki Roshi's simple and profound teaching. She took so many of us under her wing personally, and yet it wasn't really personal. She wasn't my friend or parent. She was my teacher. She had Dharma to offer, as had her husband, his son, and now their grandson, who have each taken the long plane ride to come here to America to teach. And I think we are learning. I feel we are. I trust we are. And yet it seems best if we're never quite sure. There is so much for each of us to learn, and among them, how to be good hosts and good guests, a profound social form which, among all the world's cultures, the tea ceremony may know best. It's also what Zen practice may know best. The host and the guest are not two, and yet they are not the same either. There's something in that relationship that each side needs to learn from the other by taking turns, by altering our point of view. Here's another very good story, this one from the Zen tradition about a tea gathering of two Zen monks and a local samurai lord by the name of Sendai. The monk named Tetsugu had invited Lord Sendai to tea when his Dharma brother, Choan, dropped by for a visit. Lord Sendai invited Choan to join them for tea. Tetsugu had chosen an especially precious antique tea bowl that Lord Sendai had given to him, which he set down on the tatami mat as he began to make tea. After drinking the tea, Lord Sendai followed the tradition of admiring the bowl, after which he passed it to Choan so he too might do the same. Choan suddenly reached out with his ceremonial stick, his kotsu, and he smashed the tea bowl. "Now look at the authentic tea bowl that exists before birth," Choan said. Tetsugu turned pale and nearly fainted, but Lord Sendai remained upright and present, saying to Tetsugu, I gave you that tea bowl, but I would like you to give it back to me now. But before you give it back to me, please have it glued together and have a box made for it. And on the box, I ask that you write the name of the bowl, which I now give as the authentic tea bowl before birth. I will reverently pass it on to my descendants. So this story is about tradition and whether or not we are holding on to a tradition without understanding its essential meaning. For the Zen student, the essential meaning of things is that they don't exist, that their fundamental characteristic is a lack of inherent existence. And so do we break the tea bowl? Like, well, whatever. Or like Golem in The Lord of the Rings, do we try to possess it? My precious. The essential meaning is that there is no essential meaning referring to something other than itself. While making tea, you make tea. And while eating lunch, you eat lunch. While washing the dog, you wash the dog. It's so simple, and yet almost no one can pull it off. Pull off the veil of concepts through which we continuously evaluate and view the world. That's my lovely tea bowl. And today I'll be having soup for lunch. And what dog? Practice is not a matter of time or some duration of time. It's always exactly what is happening right now. It is always in the form of you yourself as both host and guest of the present moment. Whether you're walking or kneeling or serving or receiving the offering, the practice of awareness arises as a boundless stream when you and the world appear inseparably together. Nothing to hold on to, nothing to break, no one to protect or to hate. And how about you? Would you like a bowl of tea? The last time I made tea for Suzuki Sensei before she returned to Japan, I was having a pretty hard time, mostly because I kept crying. When I finally finished whisking and I looked into the tea bowl, there were these tiny lumps floating on the surface. I bowed and I told Sensei I was so sorry about the lumps. When I looked up, she was smiling at me. And then she said, "Fusan, enjoy the lumps." First calligraphy of the year. Today again, I write beginner's mind. Thank you very much.